All right, so if you're wondering what that good smell is, they're doing taste testing in the back kitchen for a new restaurant that's coming. But not taste testing for everybody. I'm just letting you know why the smell is that's torturing you. That's what it is. All right, well, thank you for coming back. For those of you that are here the first time, my name is Sam Caston-Smith. I'm the education pastor here. And I love archaeology. Not just for what it does for us intellectually, but it's an encouragement to the faith when you read these stories as you're walking through the Bible and you realize, these are very real events. These things actually happen. And so in session 2 tonight, we're going to be looking at the Patriarchs of Genesis. So just to stop and give because one of the things that I'd like to be able to pull out of this is just to kind of tell the story of Scripture as we go through these classes. And so last week we talked about the creation of man, how God made man and all of the things that go with that. That's Genesis 1 and 2. Genesis 3 is the fall. Shortly after that you have the flood. And then you have the Tower of Babel with the scattering of all the nations. And so just what we covered last week walks you from Genesis 1 through Genesis 11. Today we're going to be going from Genesis 12 through Genesis 50, finishing off the book of Genesis and looking at some of the evidence that's out there for the period of the patriarchs. What's a patriarch? A patriarch comes from, it's two words, arche and pater, so it's fathers at the beginning or early, arche. And so these are the early fathers, the ruling fathers, and you would know them as men like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Jacob's 12 sons, including Judah and Joseph. And so, as we talked about the schedule, we did creation, and now tonight we're talking about Genesis and the patriarchs. And next week, we'll be talking about the Hebrew slavery and the Exodus. When I was going through seminary, when I was in school, we were told that there was no evidence for that. But we just have to take it by faith. And now, as they're digging in particular cities in the Nile Delta, really fascinating stuff is coming up. And so I want to start with a quote, and I'll just mix some of these quotes in throughout the series, throughout all 9 units. But this is a guy who is a very famous archaeologist named Nelson Gluck. He's the professor, former president at Hebrew Union College. And listen to what he says. He's writing this in the mid-60s. Now, prior to this, there was a lot of confidence in biblical archaeology that the archaeological record was affirming what they found. And he wrote this. He said, "It may be stated categorically that no archaeological discovery has ever controverted a biblical reference. Scores of archaeological findings have been made which confirm in clear outline or exact detail historical statements in the Bible. And by the same token, proper evaluation of the biblical descriptions has often led to amazing discoveries." And so what this guy says is, the Bible is proven so reliable that what I do when I go out into the field and when I conduct excavations as an archaeologist, I look at the Bible, I take historical context clues, and I go to the place that the Bible is telling me to dig. And thus far, it has not been ruled inaccurate. Everything is panned out. Well, right about in the 60s and in the 70s, you could probably guess, theological liberalism crept into the church. Academic circles started walking away from the idea that the Bible was inerrant, that it was inspired, that it was even trustworthy, into a camp called minimalism. And this is what the theory that they came up with. If you go to college today, if you take seminary classes, depending on the seminary you're at, if you go to Christian colleges, you'll hear some of these theories. This one is pretty popular. So beginning in roughly several decades ago, 60s, this idea came along that the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, that they were all invented during the Babylonian Exile, which you can see up there. It's the years 600 BC to 540 BC, roughly. So during that time, the Israelites had been conquered. They were taken away from Jerusalem and the land of Judea. They were taken to Babylon. And so these scholars say, okay, this is what happened. They were in captivity. It was a really sad time. And on their way back home, when the Persians came along and conquered the Babylonians and then told them, you can go home now. Then at that moment, a lot of scribes said, well, we don't have a national identity. We don't know who we are. And so I got an idea. Let's invent some characters and let's invent some stories. Oh yeah, Abraham, that sounds like a great idea. And let's say that he had a bunch of sons. Moses, a Hebrew slavery, that'll be great. And we'll talk about how our God defeated the mightiest empire and then judges and kings. And all of these things will come along and we'll invent a history. But if you know biblical history, let's just walk through it so you get a sense of the timeline. And God does something that helps people who have a hard time remembering numbers, like me. A timeline. So if you go to 2000 BC, on every 500-year mark, God gives us a major figure in the scriptures, one of the most major. So in 2000 BC, you'll see Abraham comes along right about that time. And then Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and his 12 sons will eventually, the 12 sons go down into Egypt where they are enslaved for 400 years. Well, then you're going to have another major figure come along in the Bible. Who's that going to be? The guy who leads them out of slavery. So at 1500, thereabouts, you have Moses comes along, and guess what? That's followed by a 400-year period of judges. It's actually 369 years, but it's pretty close, right? It helps with timelines. Around 1000, at the end of the judges, all of the Israelites say, oh man, we want to be like all the other nations. We want a king. And so along comes Saul, David, Solomon, the temple is built, and it launches, and then you have 400 years of kingdom. And in 586 BC, the Babylonians come, they destroy Jerusalem, they tear it down, they send everybody off into exile, right? And then in about 516, they come, they rebuild the temple in 516, and so you get the second temple, flurry of prophets talking about the coming of a Messiah. And then you get 400 years after the book of Malachi where there's just prophetic silence. And then guess what happens at the next 500-year mark? Kind of the most important one for us. Jesus. Here he comes. And so if you're looking to remember, 2000 Abraham, 400 years of slavery. 1500 Moses, 400 years of judges. David at 1000, 400 years of kingdom and divided kingdom. Rebuilding of the second temple, flurry of prophets, 400 years of silence. And then Jesus. It's helpful to orient yourself to some of this timeline. So what happens is scholars come forth. This guy named Walter Brueggemann, professor of theology, Eden Theological Seminary, and he says this. The Old Testament in its final form is a product and response of the Babylonian exile. So the books that you read in your Old Testament, all made up, just to give Israel a history. The Torah was likely completed in response to the exile. We need a story. We don't have a story. We've been nomads. Let's make it up. So this is what their timeline looks like. At about somewhere in between 586 and 516, they write all of these books and prophets and everything else of the Old Testament. But prior to that, blank slate. Didn't exist. Entirely made up. And so you can have seminary professors who say the period of the patriarchs, Exodus, conquest, or judges as devised by the writers of scriptures never existed. You got to wonder, why are you a seminary professor then? I would like to devote my life to something that's entirely untrue. And so tonight what we're going to do is we're going to look at 4 different sections, okay? Was the period of the patriarchs, because it's one of the more difficult ones to prove. It's the older one. And they didn't build cities, right? They lived in tents. So it's going to be hard to prove. But can you go through the writings in Genesis about the patriarchs and take confidence that it wasn't written 1,400 years after they claim that it happened? And it was just made up. Well, they would have to have some really lucky guesses. So we're going to look at evidence that corrects the record of skepticism, because for a long time, skeptics have been claiming that all these historical details and cities and cultures were just made up by biblical authors. Is that true? We're going to look at the destruction of Sodom. If you know the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, where God rains down fire and brimstone on a city, doesn't that sound just absolutely fantastic? Not in a good way, but like fables, right? Like, really? God rained down fire on a city? You're going to go with that? You believe that? Is it true? We'll look at it. We're going to look at the cultural and legal norms. So try not to nod off during that section. I will try to like dance or something while I talk about it. But it's really fascinating how different stories that you read about in Genesis that are bizarre on their face, now all of a sudden when you look at ancient legal codes, bring context and you're like, that's why that crazy story happened. And you see that the ancient legal codes that date back to the periods of the patriarchs at 2000 BC speak into Genesis. And we'll also look at the legacy of Joseph, because if he was raised up to be the right hand of Pharaoh to save the world from a famine, we should expect to find some historical evidence about him, right? Is there? That's tonight. More on Channel 11. All right, so first up, does the historical evidence discovered in the Mesopotamian culture, so the Fertile Crescent, this is where Abraham is born, Tigris and Euphrates, all of that region, does it support the biblical accounts of the patriarchs? And so when you're in Genesis 10, when you're in Genesis 11, you'll read about the Table of Nations. In Genesis 11, you'll read about a guy named Nimrod, and he goes off and he founds all these cities. Some of those cities are going to be mentioned multiple times throughout that. Do these cities exist? Did the writers who wrote it 1,400 years after this is claimed, did they just have lucky guesses? Let's look at some of the things. So God in chapter 12 does something in redemptive history that's kind of new. I'm going to explain. When God makes man, he makes him on a mission and he says, I'm creating you after my image and I'm placing you in a garden, and your mission is to take the beauty of my design and I want you to spread it to the ends of the earth. I want you to take the beauty of the garden and I want you to take it to the whole earth, which is kind of the same as our mission. We would call it the Great Commission, but what are we trying to do? We're trying to spread the beauty of God's design through the gospel to the ends of the earth, to turn darkness into light, to turn wilderness into gardens, to make things beautiful, right? And then Genesis 3, man said, I don't want you, God. We spat in his face, and God came along and said, even though you've rebelled against me, even though you've spat in my face, even though your selfishness is going to bring ruin to the world, I am not giving up on you. And he gives a promise of the gospel in Genesis 3 where he says, there's going to come a seed of the woman who's going to crush the head of the snake, whose job is just to go around and devour the dust of the dead ones. Very beautiful language, but somebody's going to put an end to that banquet of death. He's going to be the savior of the world. And from that moment on, every pregnancy is like, is this going to be the one? And then you get Noah, where God judges the world, but he comes after Noah. He paints the bow in the sky with, by the way, this weapon of war turned away from the earth. And where is it pointed? Into the heavens, because God will never flood the world again. The wound will be stricken. It's by someone who's in heaven, God himself. And so the flood passes, and God repeats to Noah the covenant. Through you, all the world is going to be blessed. And you're like, okay, this could be any pregnancy. Anyone could be the savior of the world. Where's he going to come from? And when you get to Genesis chapter 12, all of a sudden, God limits the pool. And he comes to a guy named Abraham, and he says, Abraham, I'm calling you out of this city where you're living in the Mesopotamian region. I want you to go from your country and from your kindred, from your father's house, to the land that I'm going to show you. Oh, I'm going to make a great nation of you. I'm going to bless you, and I'm going to make your name great so that you will be a blessing. And here's where the promise of the Messiah comes. Through you, Abraham, through your seed, through your lineage, every nation on the face of the earth is going to be blessed. Through your son is going to come the Savior of the world. And so Abraham becomes the first father of the faith. The problem is, as Hebrews tells us in chapter 11, it says, by faith Abraham made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. Why? Because he's looking forward to heaven. Well, the problem with that archaeologically is he lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob. And so if we want to prove Abraham archaeologically, like we got to look for tent pegs or something, right? There's no cities, there's no buildings. As did the other patriarchs, his son, that carry on the line that will ultimately lead to Jesus. And so let's look at some of the history of Abraham. The Bible tells us that he was born in the city of Ur. We've uncovered that. It's actually really fascinating history. You can see in this picture, that's the ziggurat, one of the ziggurats that we looked at last week that would have been considered a tower like the Tower of Babel that was built up. And in Ur, which existed up until about 2000 to 2100 BC before it was destroyed, they worshipped a god called Nana. Why is that important? Nana was a moon god, and the moon god was associated with fertility. As it is all over the world, moon gods are associated with fertility for a whole bunch of reasons. So he worshipped a god of fertility. Why would that be particularly troubling to live in a city that's devoted entirely to the worship of a fertility god for Abraham? What's his problem? His wife is barren. They can't have kids. He lives in a city. He grows up in a city. This God has failed him his whole life. And the whole city revolves around fertility. And Abraham is walking around in shame. I can't have kids. My wife Sarah is barren. We can't have kids. The pain, the stigma of that would have been absolutely crushing. So the destruction of Ur comes along, where the Bible tells us that Abraham picked up out of Ur and traveled north out of Ur for some reason. It doesn't tell us. It just tells us his dad Terah picks up and moves. Well, we know right about this time that Ur's destroyed by the Elamites. That'd be a good reason to move, right? And so we're told in the Bible that Terah takes his son and his grandson Lot, the son of Haran, who will be Abraham's adopted nephew, his daughter-in-law Sarah, the wife of his son Abram, and they set out together from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. So here's another city, Haran. Does that exist in the archaeological record, or did they really get it right? Well, before we go there, this is a tablet that they found that tells us about the destruction of Ur. And it's a prayer that was recorded as though it came from one of their gods, the wife of Nana. And listen to what she says. I verily clasped my legs, laid hold of my arms. Truly I shed my tears before one of their gods, On. I made supplication, I myself, before Enlil, another one of their gods. And she's pleading, may my city not be ravaged. I said to them, may Ur not be ravaged. And the gods were silent. They flee. They go to Haran. Is that such a place? Sure enough is. So they've uncovered Haran. It's exactly where we should expect. It comes from an Akkadian word, Haranu, which literally means crossroads, because it was a center point of travel between the east and the west. And the unique thing, the interesting thing about Haran is it's the only other city in the Mesopotamian region that worshiped the patron god, take a guess, Nana. Same god that they worshipped in Ur, the fertility god. And so Terah and his kids, they go and they're like, oh, they worship the same god. We're going to transplant. We're going to go there. Well, what are the odds? Makes sense as to why he would stay there. And so then Abraham just continues living in a city that is just fertility, 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 fertility. That's the chief aim. 75 years old, no kids, no fertility, which means your God has either abandoned you, forsaken you, doesn't listen to you, you're shamed and ridiculed by all the people of your town, and then God comes to him, and what's God's promise? Leave all this. I will make you a great nation. Trust me to be your God of fertility, because I'm a God who can overcome circumstances where life should be impossible. You're 75 years old. Your wife is 65 years old. Postmenopausal. Barren. Watch me bring life where only death reigns. And Abraham says, well, this God hasn't done anything good for me. I'm in. Where do I need to go? And God calls him, and Abraham starts trekking, right? Other places like Jacob will return to a place called Nahor in the Bible when he goes back home to receive a wife. Is that in the Bible? Oh, look. So Abraham leaves Ur. He settles in the city of Nahor in the region of Haran. That's where Jacob goes home. They found ancient clay tablets written in Akkadian that date back to this time period. And guess what city they mention? Nahor. Really lucky guest for those post-exile scribes, right? Like, there's historical merit in all of this. And so moving along, there's other cities. The cities of Kish. Was that a mythological city? Oh my goodness, there it is. Nippur, oh my goodness, there it is. And and Haran, and Akkad, and Erech. All of these cities uncovered that it's like the pen that wrote the book of Genesis was really historically accurate. And all of these cities are now being uncovered, which suggests ancient authorship. If I asked you to write about a territory in Saskatchewan from 14 centuries ago, give me everything you got. Go. They're not even in the region. They're writing about a land that's far away from Israel. Without what? Without Google. Thank you. That's very true. That's a good point. You might be able to do it with your iPhone for Saskatchewan. But this is like, there's no hope of being this accurate. And so when it says Abraham rose and bowed to the Hittites. That's one section of Genesis, right? And all the skeptics jumped up and down. Very famous objection. They're talking about Hittites in Genesis 23, dating them back to 2000 BC or thereabouts. What a joke. The Hittites are a made-up culture. They never existed. Of course the Bible is all mythology. And that's talking about the land of Canaan back in the days of Abraham. Are you kidding me? What a joke. Of course we know that Canaan wasn't even founded until way after Abraham. Clearly this was all made up. And then we find the Ebla tablets. And so Dr. Paolo Mathai, I don't know how to pronounce that, archaeology professor at the University of Rome, examined the ruins of Ebla in Syria, and he found 11,000 clay tablets. You can see them as they were when he found them there. And the library affirmed many biblical details. For example, skeptics claim that Canaan didn't exist. The tablets date back to 2300 BC, before Abraham, and they mention Canaan all over the place. I would like an apology, skeptics. Don't hold your breath. I'm kidding. I am a natural skeptic, which is why I love this stuff. Another one is the Hittites. Oh, the Hittites are fictional. But then, in 1906, Dr. Hugo Winkler is digging around, and he stumbles across an ancient city called Hattusa, the capital city of the Hittites. And they find a stunning amount of stuff. They find a library of roughly 10,000 clay tablets that record their history. They find the palace. They find the temple. Here you go, Hattusa, Turkey. So the Hittites do, in fact, exist. So are there any questions yet, by the way? I'm trying to take a breath or let you breathe tonight. What about, yes? Of course it is. Okay, so it's a good question. So why are the cities buried? One of the things that we'll talk about tonight, archaeologists are always digging, right? If you go and you stand in modern day Israel, if you've been on the Israel trip, one of the weirdest things in the world is you'll be right next to the Wailing Wall, right? This western wall that goes up. What you don't know when you first arrive there, or at least what I didn't know, is that when you go 40 feet below your feet, you're in the ancient streets of first century Jerusalem that have been dug out, uncovered. You can go down there in tunnels and walk on them, streets that Herod laid. And what happens is cities, especially, get destroyed. Somebody comes and conquers them, and they're too lazy to remove the rubble, so they're like, oh, this will make great foundation. And then they build on top of it, and then they build on top of it, and everybody keeps getting destroyed. Or sandstorms and other things come and bury it, and in time, all of these cities are buried, all of them. One day, this will be buried. Hopefully, Jesus comes back before then. Is there any evidence of major events recorded in Genesis? And so this is one of the first ones. In Genesis 14, we're told a story. So in Genesis 13, you have Lot and Abraham, and they're tremendously wealthy. They have too much money to live with each other. And so Abraham says to Lot, you pick which way you want to go. We can't live together. We're fighting too much. And Lot says, ooh, look at that land over there on the other side of the Jordan. It's well watered like the garden of the Lord. It's right near that city over there called, Sodom. Yeah, I'm going to take that land. And Abraham says, okay, well then I'll go this way. So the next chapter, and God is like, man, the Sodomites that's a really wicked culture. Says it in Genesis 13. Well, you get to Genesis 14, and we're told that Sodom, which is really wealthy, draws the attention of these 4 really, really large major empires of the ancient world. And they team together, and they come down south, and they sack all these cities. Sodom, Gomorrah, the cities of the plain. And in the process, they take Abram's nephew Lot as captive. And the Bible tells us that these guys, Amraphel was king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Kedar-Laomar, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goyim. These kings went to war. Well, who are these people? Well, if on a map, this is where they come from. And so you can see, here's Goyim, or the Hittites. They come down. Everybody's coming from these different directions. They hit all these cities through there, especially the cities of the plain over here, which are tremendously wealthy. And they take all the wealth, all the residents, the Sodomites, and Lot, right? And they lead them away. And what Abraham does is stunning. He goes with a group of 318 guys of his own men. So Abraham's no like podunk farmer. He's got people, you know. So Abraham takes 318 of his own people along with some allies, and he says, I'm going after this major empire that just whipped all these major cities but ignored me because I only have tents, right? And so he chases after them at night, leads a raid, conquers them, defeats them, takes all the captives, the Sodomite captives, and Lot, and all their possessions, bring them back. And here's what's cool. I love this because this shows the mercy of our God. He's just rescued one of the most wicked cities in the history of the Bible. It's a city, Sodom. It is a city that is kind of synonymous with wickedness today. And when he gets back, do you know what God does? He sends this guy named Melchizedek, pre-incarnate Jesus, right? His name means the king of righteousness. He's described as the king of Salem. He comes bearing bread and wine. Abraham's going to give him a tenth of all that he has. You hear all the nods toward his divinity? And this is what God does. The priest of God celebrates Abraham for showing mercy and justice to the Sodomites. Whoa. You risked your own life to chase after people that I've already declared to be wicked, and then God celebrates them for doing it. What does that mean for us? That means that we are to show mercy even to Sodomites. We're to love them. We're to risk our well-being, to chase after them, to rescue them. It's gospel in motion. God is the one who is the ultimate judge. And by the way, after this, so this is Kenneth Kitchens. He's a very well-respected scholar. He says, the right names go with the right places. Chedorlaomer is clearly an Elamite name. It's of a king. Arioch is attested in tablets found at Mari tablets, Nuzi in Mesopotamia. Amraphel is less clear, so these are the four major kings of the empire. But Tidal is universally recognized as an early form of Tudkalia, well known from the Hittite world centered in Anatolia or Turkey. And so all these names actually bear out historically. That's a really lucky guess from 600 BC, remembering these names from 1400 years earlier, right? Really lucky. So now let's get to the part where God is the judge, right? And Sodom doesn't turn, and they remain wicked, and they're horribly wicked. And God comes to Abraham and he says, there's this city in the plain, and man, the cries of the people are coming up to me. It is wicked as all get out. I'm about to destroy it. And Lot's there. And Abraham's like, oh my goodness, like, no. You can't do that. Well, God, you're a righteous judge. Surely you wouldn't hurt the innocent. You'd spare the city for the sake of the righteous. And God's like, you know me. Absolutely. I would never judge the righteous. And so Abraham says, what if I can find 50 people in the city? God says, I'll spare it. Abraham, knowing Sodom, says, what about 45? I'll spare it. 40? Spare it. 30? I'll spare it. 20? I'll spare it. How about 10? I'll spare it. What does he mean by that? If you show me righteousness at all, I'll spare the city. Can you hear gospel in that? No, there's none righteous. There's no one who can stand before God and say, I'm your righteous one. I don't deserve judgment. But God says, if one righteous shows up in the midst of the city, he will extend mercy to all for the sake of the one. Praise God, we have the one who stands in our place. And by the way, he doesn't just go and say, okay, I'm righteous, and I'll stand in the midst of all you heathens so that God doesn't scorch you. You know what he does? This is the gospel. He says, give me your mess. Give it to me. Lay on your sin. Pour it on me. I'm taking it. Give it to me. And by faith, take my righteousness so that when God looks at you, he sees the very righteousness that I have earned and given to you. And then he goes outside the city and God pours the wrath upon him so that the wicked and the selfish can be spared. What an amazing, incredible God. And so where is Sodom? You remember it says when Lot and Abraham part ways, here are the clues. It says Lot looked up. So they're in the plains of Israel, right? They're at Bethel and Ai, which are going to be over here, between there. And it says Lot looked up. So he can see, wherever he is, he can see Sodom. Because it says he saw the whole plain of the Jordan was well watered like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt toward Zoar. And so Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan and set out to the east. And the two men parted company, and Abram lived in the land of Canaan, while Lot pitched his tents at Sodom, which is going to be this really big city, is the theory. And so, Dr. Stephen Collins got permission from the Jordanian government to go into their turf, to go over into this land and say, I would like to dig, because all of the clues say Sodom should be somewhere over here. So he goes there, and this is what he finds. This is Stephen Collins, professor of archaeology at Trinity Southwestern University. Since he's found this, archaeologists and scholars from all over the world, secular universities, they're all over the place at the site because it's been pretty impressive. He said, I believe I've discovered the ancient city of Sodom. He said, it matches every Sodom criterion, including location, size, fortifications, architecture, the network of surrounding towns. And this thriving city met a fiery destruction during the Middle Bronze Age, which is between those years. He puts it at the later side, and left it a wasteland for 7 years. So whatever this destruction that happened to the city, 700 years nobody set foot in this place again. So this is an aerial picture of Sodom, and you can see, I got to do it on this screen. So you can see, like down here, that's the Jordan River today. That's the Dead Sea. So we're looking from the east, from the west to the east, and that would be the city of Sodom. You get up closer, this is the hill, the tell of Sodom, and once you go down, then the rest of this would be within the walls, and it's visible. It fits all the criteria. It would be where it is. And so there's an aerial view. You can see where the walls would have been around this massive, massive ancient city. For its time period, 5 times bigger than Jericho. Massive, massive city. And so, before we get into this, I want to explain to you, what do archaeologists do so that you'll understand what they're finding? How do they date things? So, if you look at it, if this is an ancient city, right? And here's an old city that was conquered, and they layered on top of it, and they built upon top of it, and they built upon top of it, and they built upon top of it. The older city would be found the more you dig, right? You go deep, and you get to the first city that was laid before all these other cities built on top of it, right? And so you can say an absolute date is, hey, I found a coin that has the date on it or the name of a king. And man, I can be really confident of when this coin came from. But other than that, it's relative dating. So it's on the style of things. But the higher it is, the more recent. The lower it is, the deeper it is, the more ancient. And so this is what I was talking about. If I'm standing in the city of Jerusalem at the Wailing Wall, what I don't know is under my feet is this. That Wailing Wall continues down 40 feet, and you're walking around in this kind of stuff. Underneath the modern day city of Jerusalem, it's wild. You're kind of waiting for the city to just go, you know, or at least I am because I'm claustrophobic and paranoid. But you can see it builds on top of it. And so how do they date? Well, they pay attention to particular pottery styles. To me, it seems very imprecise. And they're like, well, if the vase has one of these things, then it's Iron Age. But if it has, you know, a broader thing with the 2 things higher up on it, what? Like, I'll take your word for it. I don't see much different. They all look like pots to me. But these are actual things that are in archaeologist manuals The closest I could come on a whim is to say, if I took the dates off of all of these boxes, could you approximate the decade that car came from, just by the look of it? Like, it would take some studying to go, well, the older cars had the really kind of bubbly fronts and the short trunks, and then the front went out, and then in the 60s, they got this fascination with wings on the back of the car for some reason. And you can see how the car styles change. The hood starts slanting and sloping more downward. And you can kind of take a guess at when a car was manufactured just based on the look of it. Similar style with pottery. I don't have an eye for it, but apparently some people do. And so this is Sodom. It's 62 acres inside 18 feet thick walls. This is a serious city that was not getting conquered very easily, right? They are digging. You can see the people in this picture. The yellow and the red are two different materials that made those 18-foot thick walls. This is a for real city. And what they found recently, so they're digging around in this ancient city. They're finding all kinds of cool things. And then additional evidence is coming from other scholars that right over that region, there was a cataclysmic event. And it's this. So this is from the headline of Newsweek. Biblical city of Sodom was blasted to smithereens by a massive asteroid explosion. Okay, that's interesting. Forbes, new science suggests biblical city of Sodom was smote. What a word, smote. That feels very biblical, doesn't it? No one ever uses smote outside of the Bible. Was smote by an exploding meteor. So what is all this about? Well, what they found was there's evidence of a massive meteor explosion that took place right on the northern edge of the Dead Sea, and it was intense. And all of the areas that are on the east side of the Kikar, on that side of the Jordan River, exactly where ancient Sodom or Tel El Hammam would have been, got utterly scorched. And we're going to talk about the intensity of how big this explosion was. But this is the palace, the reconstruction of what they think the palace would have looked like in Sodom. When this explosion happened, it just sheared the whole top 3 floors of this palace and threw them into the neighboring valley. They are finding the remnants of this palace thrown outside the ancient city. The blast was that powerful. So a team of all kinds of people, they had archaeologists, they had astrophysicists, and all kinds of different scholars came together and they wrote what this would be like. And it was published at the University of South Carolina's Institute for Archaeology and Anthropology. And I'm just going to read this, but hang with me. Imagine this, because this is what they think happened. They had no idea an unseen icy space rock was speeding toward them at about 38,000 miles an hour. Flashing through the atmosphere, the rock exploded in a massive fireball about 2.5 miles above the ground. The blast was 1,000 times more powerful than the Hiroshima atomic bomb. The shocked city dwellers who stared at it were blinded instantly. Air temperatures rapidly rose above 3,600 degrees Fahrenheit. Clothing and wood immediately burst into flames. Swords, spears, mud bricks, and pottery began to melt. Almost immediately, the entire city was on fire. Some seconds later, a massive shockwave smashed into the city. Moving at about 740 miles per hour, it was more powerful than the worst tornado ever recorded. The deadly winds ripped through the city, demolishing every building. They sheared off the top 40 feet of the 4-story palace and blew the jumbled debris into the next valley. None of the 8,000 people or any animals within the city survived. Their bodies were torn apart and their bones blasted into small fragments. So you go into the base level of where this red palace was, and it's called the Red Palace. Why? Because the intense heat and the burning actually baked the bricks red, permanently seared by the heat. And they say this was due to citywide destruction of fire. Just as the Bible says, right? When God judged Sodom and Gomorrah, what does it say? Then the Lord rained down burning sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord out of the heavens. So the destruction comes from above. Here you see one of the intact rooms when they dig down. That's the level of ash. You can still see the gray that goes all the way to the floor. That's how much ash was buried that they had to dig through. And then as you come up in the building, so this is the level of ash, and as you come up in the building, it's all charred. Where's it charred? On the top, suggesting that the fire came from above. This is an example of how they believe that they would have been, some of these huts and houses would have been built, and the heat was so hot from above that you can actually see, this is a real life picture. This is all model, but you can see the real life picture. This is molten clay where it just started melting down into the beams. How hot was it? This is shocking. When I saw this, I was like, that's wild. So this picture over here is pottery that was taken, pottery shard that was found in Tel El Hammam, what they believe is Sodom. This green thing over here was pottery that was found in New Mexico after the atomic bomb explosion when they tested it in New Mexico. This is called Trinite Rock. The reason why it's called Trinite Rock is the name of the atomic bomb that was tested was called Trinity, right? And so it's Trinite Rock. It's the first time pottery like that has ever been seen. We've never seen pottery exposed to that level of heat, but you go over to Sodom and it shows all the same pocking. Incredible heat. It had to be above 2,000 degrees, above the heat of magma. Now this is before any time where you had any kind of pyro warfare. There's no tar, there's no thing like that could generate that much heat in the ancient world. A house fire, for example, burns at 1,100 degrees, nowhere near hot enough. If the city just caught fire, would not produce these. This is some kind of stunning fire. The surfaces, this is more from their stuff. The surfaces of the pottery and melt glass are speckled. So how hot did it get? It got hotter than the atomic bomb blast. It's speckled with tiny melted metallic grains, including iridium, with a melting point of 4,435 degrees Fahrenheit. So whatever hit it was hot enough to melt that. Platinum that melts at 3215 Fahrenheit. Zirconium silicate at 2800 Fahrenheit. So they looked and they found that in the sand crystals of this region, what is called shock quartz, it's when something has a blast impact, a pressure that just comes down and bam, and it literally cracked the sand grains. Very rare. It's called shocked quartz. And in order to create shocked quartz, the blast has to be at least 725,000 pounds of pressure in a square inch. So imagine it standing on a square inch pole, 725,000 pounds for that 1 square inch. This is a ferocious blast. It would be the equivalent of stacking 120 pickup trucks or 6 Abrams tanks on your thumb. The entire city. It was so intense, the heat and the pressure was so intense that when they look at things that are like caked into the ground, they found speckled in them what are called diamondoids, which are like diamonds. How do you create a diamond? Intense heat and pressure. And so in a moment, bam, this intense pressure and heat comes, and it leaves little diamondoids in the pottery because it was so intense and so hot so quickly. Wild. And so this is just one of my pet theories that I love. So in the report they found, because if you've ever been to the region, how many of you have ever been to the Dead Sea? How many of you have gotten into it? It's very salty. You float. If you get into it with a hemorrhoid, you will know about it. Don't ask how I know that. Somebody told me. It's Pastor Tom told me that. No, I'm kidding. So in their report, they go around and they take soil samples and ash samples. And they found that this whole thing devastated 500 square kilometers immediately north of the Dead Sea. So it comes in at an angle, bam, and it blows the Dead Sea 9 times higher salinity than the ocean water. Tremendously salty. So it hits and it blows that, wiping out 100% of all the Middle Bronze Age cities that are in that disk that we saw earlier, but also stripping agricultural soils from once fertile fields and covering the East Kikar, including Tel El Hammam, with, get this, a superheated brine of Dead Sea and hydride salts pushed over the landscape by the event's frontal shockwave. Say what? So why is this place, like if you go there today, it doesn't grow things very well. Like Lot is describing it like the garden of the Lord. If you go to modern day Jordan in this region, you're like, if this was the garden of the Lord, no thanks. It's desert, it's rocks, it's a lot of that stuff. They have irrigation, but it's not the way Lot described it. Well, what happens in ancient warfare when you would conquer your enemy? You would take what and scatter it on their fields? Salt. Why? Because if you scattered salt on their fields, crops would not grow. So now you have a meteor explosion that hits this, and all these superheated brine of anhydride salts go and cover everything and freeze it in a salt case. Does that sound familiar? What happens in the story? One of the most unbelievable parts of the story is God says, get out of there, don't look back, don't turn back. And so they're all walking along, and you get the impression that Lot's wife is like, all my treasures, I can't leave. And so she turns, and she literally starts making her way back from Sodom, and it says she turned into a pillar of salt. Could God turn someone into a pillar of salt if he wanted to? Standing here right now, he could. It would be quite a show, right? Like, he could do that. But what's interesting is it says that this explosion, and nowhere in any of this does it mention Lot's wife, but as I'm reading, I'm thinking, man, it covered everything with that intensity of salt. Can you see him coming back, finding the corpse of his wife and saying, like, she's salt? Very fascinating to me. So a geochemical analysis, I apologize already, just starting those words. A geochemical analysis of 6 soil and ash samples revealed that salt and sulfate levels were higher than 6%. So 60,000 part per million in the ash layer and 50,000 parts per million in the soil layers, all through this region where Sodom is. The oceans, if you took a drink of the ocean water, very salty, right? That's 35,000 parts per million. So the soil at Sodom is almost twice the level of salt that's in the ocean water. You're not growing anything there. It is absolutely covered with salt. And so, okay, that tells us of the destruction, but we learned some indicators about what this city was like as well, which is interesting. So it's 115 acres of excavation, including the city's gates, the royal palace. And what they find in there is something that's totally atypical. You don't find them in this region. The city has pillars in the gates. And so Collins, archaeological professor, says such pillared architecture is more Aegean. What does that mean? It's Greek. It comes from places like the Minoan culture or Mycenae, places that are in Greece. We don't find that over here among Canaanite architecture. And that suggests a connection to the world of the Minoans. Well, that's really interesting because what are the Minoans especially known for? They're on the island of Crete. They're known for the Minotaur, a fascination with bulls. But they're also known for being one of the most perverse cultures in the history of the world. Lots of Minoan influence in this city. So we know from long before this was ever discovered that the Minoan culture at Crete had trade routes with Cyprus, with Tyre, all through this region, with Egypt. So they had a connection, and we know that. But what they find there is they find bullheads, like little bronze bullheads. Well, what is that? And why are the bull's horns facing down? So the archaeologists come along and they say, well, we know exactly what this is. If you went to Crete and you went into the Minoan culture, they loved the bulls, and the leading sport in the Minoan culture was not football or soccer or baseball, it was bull leaping. And so you find all kinds of art and frescoes and statues of people. I'm trying to imagine this. Like, how do you train for this? The bull is running at you. You run at the bull. As it approaches and gets near, you leap in the air. You grab hold of its horns. You flip over it and either land on its backside or at the back end of the bull. This was a sport. And you find the stuff all over the place, like ancient frescoes and an obsession with the bull. This is where the Minotaur comes from. What's the Minotaur? It has the head of a bull, body of a human. That's one of their mythological creatures. Obsession with the bull. And what do you find in the architecture? Well, you find the Minoan, the bull with the horns down, which would represent what's going on when you're playing the sport. But you also find phallic images. right? You don't find that in ancient Canaanite culture of this time period in that region. And so the downward-facing bullhead suggests the Sodomites were either settled or heavily influenced by Minoan cultures, and they were perverse. So what do we know? Now, this is children, guard your ears time. What do we know about Minoan culture? So this is a direct quote from what he's writing about the connection. He says, the Minoan connection provides an extraordinary backstory for the attempted abduction of Lot's angelic visitors. Remember, God sends two angels who look human. They show up in the city, and they're taken into Lot's house, and all the men of the city want to come and beat down the door and rape them. And you're thinking, what kind of city is this? Mark was like, that sounds like parts of Miami. It's terrible. But anyway, listen, it says Minoan pederasty, trying to have sex with children, was in fact the very structure of society by which boys were raised into men. It was the rule, not the exception. Each boy at age 12 in the Minoan civilization was taken as an eromenos, beloved, by a 22-year-old Erastus lover, to be raised for 8 years in a male-male sexual bond. It was usually initiated, how? With a ceremonial kidnapping performed by a gang of ritual abductors sent by an older male. Doesn't that add some context to this story? Like all of a sudden you see unattached men come into the town. There's no spouses. They haven't gone through this ritual. It's really sacred. And all of a sudden you get a whole bunch of men banging on the door demanding to abduct your visitors. That sounds a lot like this Minoan practice. It gives color to it. It's not just it's a city that's depraved, but they're not acting on impulse. They're offended that he's violating tradition. That's how wicked this city is. Really repulsive, if that's correct. And so that is the city of Sodom. How else do you explain all that? Seems really plausible, right? Well, that's Genesis 19. Lucky guess. How about this? Are there ancient cultural norms and legal codes that are reflected in the stories of the patriarchs? So if you have permission to take a nap, this is it. When we get to Joseph, you got to wake up. And if you know the Bible, this will help, okay? So back in the ancient world, most of the world wrote in cuneiform. Hebrew wasn't around, by the way, at this time, back in the time of the patriarchs. And so they wrote with cuneiform, which comes from a Latin word which means wedge. And so it literally looks like you used to get accused by your teacher of chicken scratch and just, it literally looks like that. How we learned how to translate that is amazing. So Abraham, if you know the story, Abraham impregnated his servant in order to bear a child in Genesis 16. Sarah is so devastated that she can't bear children. She says, here, take my servant Hagar. Awful, right? Normal in the ancient world, awful. In Genesis 16, and while this is a sinful act, the Ur-Nammu law code, where'd that come from? Abraham's birthplace. So this is his culture. This is what he's born in. This is the norm. There's that stone that you see on the left there allowed husbands to conceive a child with a servant or concubine in order to produce an heir if the man's wife was incapable of having children. So before the law of God, the Ten Commandments aren't around. Moses hasn't given the law of God in Exodus or Leviticus or Deuteronomy. This is all pre the law of God. He's operating off of what he knows. And in the Ur-Nammu law code where he comes from, that's normal behavior. But you see in the Bible, like the cultures represented. These are Nuzi tablets. They're discovered just southwest of Kirkuk, Iraq. 7,000 clay tablets, fragments offered, and all kinds of pictures of societal norms and culturally popular names. And we find in them that in that time period, the ancient world, you found names like Abraham and Israel and Esau and Salim. Abraham grew up in the Mesopotamian region. He would have grown up with these customs. Those names were normal. 1,400 years later, lucky guess. Like, do you think you could guess what the most popular name was in India in 600 AD? No. All match. All echoes. So the Nuzi tablets also, there's 2 times, actually 3 times in the Bible, where you have Abraham doing this twice and Isaac doing this once, where they're afraid that they're going to have to die because someone might want to take their bride. And what do they say? They tell their bride, really cowardly, awful, they're not good role models as husbands. They say to their bride, tell them you're my sister, so they don't kill me to get you. Which, by the way, why does the Bible include stories like that? It should make you want a husband who's willing to die for you. You have one, right? And so in the Newsy tablets, we find out that one of the customs that was very, very common in that day is it was all arranged marriages, which I just recently found out that the majority of marriages on planet Earth still to this day are arranged marriages. Did you know that? Pretty wild. But anyway, this custom, the fathers would go out and they would find good families and good stock, and they would adopt the daughters when they were little, and they would bring them into their family, and they would raise sons and adopted daughters together, and it helped them to control what they believed. It helped them to control who they were going to be. And then when they reached the age of marriage, they would go, ta-da, marry your sister. Congratulations. So that was common, because there's one part where Abraham says, she really is my sister, the daughter of my father, though not of my mother. So my dad has entered into this transaction, but she's not a biological daughter of my mom. It fits what the Newsy tablet is saying. There's a Newsy tablet on selling birthrights. You know the story of Jacob and Esau, right? Esau goes out into the field. Esau doesn't care about God's promises. He wants nothing to do with God. He comes in, he's hungry. Jacob is in there scheming away, lying as he always does. And he's like, you like that smell? And Esau's like, I'm famished. And Jacob's like, sell me your birthright. You smell that? Doesn't that smell good? You're so hungry. And Esau says, I don't care about God's birthright to me. I don't care. I'll trade it all for a taste of stew. And we think, what's a birthright? And why are we selling birthrights? Well, you go back in the Newsy tablets and you find that fathers were unable, against the law, to give away the birthright of a firstborn son, but the firstborn son could sell his birthright. Well, that's what happens in the Bible. Fits right to the culture. This is a weird one. In Genesis 31, Jacob is leaving his father-in-law's house after having worked for him 2 decades or so. And they're on their way, and the daughters, Laban's daughters, his father-in-law's daughters, or Jacob's 2 wives, are going, we have no share of inheritance with our father. We don't like Laban. We want to leave. We're really upset. And it says that Rachel goes into the tent of her father Laban and steals all of his household gods, puts them underneath her, sits on her camel, and they ride. And Laban gets really angry that someone has taken the household gods, which, like, if these are your household gods, like, come on, man. You got to have some standards. But those are literally gods from that region, fertility gods mainly, which is why they're posed like that. So anyway, very small. Very small. She was asking how tall they are. They're very small. And so Laban catches up, and somebody stole the gods. Jacob knows nothing about it. And he's like, if you find them here, I'll put the person to death. So he goes up to Rachel, and he's like, do you have them? Get off your camel, or whatever it was. And she says, I'm sorry, it's that time of the month. And so he passes by. Now, what's cool about that is they've worshipped, right? They were raised up in a culture where they worshipped fertility gods that failed them, because Rachel spent a ton of her marriage barren. And so now she's taking these fertility gods and she's putting them under her, and she's bleeding on them as though they are miscarried gods. It's very poetic what's going on. But why did she have to have the gods? She wasn't worshiping them. It's not like she was like, oh, the fertility gods, I don't want to leave them behind. In the Newsy tablets, we learn from Newsy tablet 51 that if you wanted any share of the inheritance, you, by law, had to take possession of the household gods. And so when she steals the household gods, you know what she's saying? I'm entitled to the inheritance. We worked hard for this, and I'm not leaving them for my brothers because they don't deserve them. It's a statement. Doesn't make sense until we discover Newsy tablet 51, right? So Mary tablets, 1925, archaeologist discovers them, and you find all these names that are very common. Benjamin, Nahor, Haran, Hazor, Laish. They're not talking about probably the biblical stories, almost certainly not. But again, you see these are common names. The Amorites, it talks about the Amorites who lived in the land. And so it's like reconstructing all of these things that would have been known in the ancient culture, that there's no way you could have guessed all this stuff 1,400 years later on a whim. Here's another one. This is a throwaway nugget of information. One of the common arguments that you used to hear from skeptics is the Bible talks about how Abraham received camels from Pharaoh, domesticated camels. And all the skeptics jumped up and down and says, we know that camels were not domesticated until way later. Abraham could not have gotten domesticated camels. And that was a common argument until we started finding ancient pottery in Egypt, ancient pictographs in Egypt, where you see men leading camels around on a leash. And dishes where it's like a pot that has a camel head. These things date 1,000 years before Abraham. So absolutely camels were domesticated. Right now we think we know where the patriarchs are buried. So if you go to Hebron, we're told that Abraham is buried there with his wife Sarah, and Isaac is buried there with his wife Rebekah, and Jacob is buried there with his wife Leah. Underneath the tomb of the patriarchs, which is in Hebron, there's a complex cave system, and in those cave systems, they have found burial plots that they believe are the patriarchs. Can't validate this because we don't have like an ancient hairbrush with their DNA on it that we can go say, oh, this is them. But the Bible gives us clues as to where they're buried. It's next to the trees of Mamre, in a particular valley, in the city of Hebron, and this matches all that. You dig down, and oh my gosh, there's a network of caves and tombs. Pretty good coincidence. So that's just fascinating. Then you have Jacob's well, where it talks about Jacob buying a field in Genesis 33. And in John 4, it talks about when Jesus meets the woman at the well, she says, are you greater than our father Jacob who gave us this well and drank from it? You can go there still to this day and drink from it. I've done it. Morgan Hendricks, our pastor's daughter, wheeled up the bucket and we drank from it. It's there. Pretty cool. And so now we get to the last part of tonight, which might be my favorite. I love this. Is there any evidence of Joseph? So what's the story of Joseph? Joseph is the firstborn son of Rachel. So Jacob loves Rachel. She's the one he loves more than everyone else, more than Leah, more than concubines and everything else. And she's barren. But the moment that she has a son, oh, Joseph, the firstborn of Rachel, loves Joseph. Clothes him with a multicolored robe. You're my favorite, dotes on him. And all the other sons are kind of, afterthoughts. And Joseph has dreams. He goes to the brothers and says, I had a dream where, the sun, moon, and stars were bowing down to my star, meaning you and mom and dad are going to bow down to me eventually. And your stalks of grain were bowing to my stalks of grain. And so the brothers are like, you conceited, arrogant punk. And so one day, Jacob, the father, so remember, you have Abraham who has Isaac, who has Jacob, and Jacob has 12 sons that become the 12 tribes of Israel. So 10 of those sons, 10 of the older brothers are sent off, and they're up to no good, and Joseph is sent to go after them, right? He's given permission to chase after them. And when he gets there, he's like, my brothers. And they're like, let's kill them. Judah, one of the brothers, says, no. Let's sell them off into slavery. Look at these Midianite traders that are coming through, going down to Egypt. We'll sell them for silver, and they can take him down to Egypt. He'll be lost forever. We can tell Dad that he got killed by an animal. We'll take his coat. We'll dip it in blood. We'll go home and go, oh, Dad, Joseph. Jacob is heartbroken. And Joseph is lost. For more than a decade, almost 2 decades go by. He becomes an adult because he's only 17, I think, when this happens. Joseph is an incredible hero. Skeptics would say, there's no way that he could have been sold for 20 shekels of silver back then. That doesn't even argue. That's way too low to be credible. And then we find evidence from the Akkadian and the Ur 3 periods, all of these areas, Old Babylon, and they're all right in that range. That's what a slave went for. So that matches up. But what is Egypt known for? Because this is important to the story and what God is teaching. Everything just about that you can think of that has to relate to Egypt is associated with death. It's deserts. Life doesn't grow in a desert. It's massive pyramids. These are people, by the way, to give you an idea of how massive the Great Pyramid is. Giant tombs. Their Bible is the Book of the Dead that would have been contemporary with Moses. Their kings are marked with a crown that has a serpent on it. My goodness, talk about on the nose. The king of the land of death is marked by the serpent, and slavery is all over the place. And so Joseph is sold down into the land of death. Well, just to give you an idea of how obsessed with death they are. So here's downtown Fort Lauderdale, right? Pretty big buildings, not to brag. That's the Great Pyramid and the other 2 pyramids that are next to it. They're massive. Absolutely massive. Saladin, I love this. So Saladin, the Muslim warrior, decided he was going to tear down just the smallest one. And he spent 8 months, trying to tear it down, only dug that much out and said, I give up, I'm leaving it there. These things are massive. He couldn't even get rid of the little one. So when is Joseph? Well, we know that Solomon builds the temple in 966 BC. We're told that he did that 480 years after the Exodus, which gets us to 446 is when we should find the Exodus. And we're told that they were enslaved in Egypt for 430 years. So you come down here and do the math. We should expect to find Joseph, in 1876 BC. So you go to the historical records and you go to Egypt and you look, okay, this is where Joseph's life would be on the biblical timeline of where we should expect them to be. He's going to fall right about 1870s when they go down there. So the patriarchs have moved from Abraham's home place in Haran down to the land of Canaan, modern-day Israel. Now they're going into Egypt and to the northeast side of the Nile Delta, which is the land of Goshen. And the Bible says at the end of Genesis, you shall live in the region of Goshen and be near me, you and your children and grandchildren, your flocks and herds and all that you have. So we know, okay, they're in Goshen. But even better clue than that is it says, then Joseph settled his father and his brothers. So there's this Joseph has a dream when he's raised up to the right hand of Pharaoh through a series of events. He predicts a coming famine, and he orders Egypt to start storing up grain. 7 years of plenty, if you know the story. He's storing up tons and tons of grain for 7 years of intense famine. Well, during the intense famine, guess what? Dad, Jacob, and all of his brothers are like, we need food, and there ain't none around here. But we know this place, this guy who's got grain. Let's go down to Pharaoh and get some grain. And so when they come down, Joseph's like, it's me, I forgive you. And he welcomes them in. And it says, Joseph settled his father Jacob and his brothers in the land of Egypt and gave them property in the best part of the land of Egypt, the land of Ramses. Okay, so we know Ramses. Well, there's a problem with that because if we're looking at the biblical timeline, the end of the era of the patriarchs comes right about here. Hebrew slavery starts. Now, they're saying that Joseph's family settles at Ramses right at 1870, but the problem with that is the city of Ramses isn't built until you get to Ramses II. Well, that's a problem, right? Doesn't work. So they're digging around at the city of Ramses, and then they discover that right underneath Ramses is an ancient city called Avaris. And so people who are what's called a redaction are saying, if we say Avaris when we're copying the scriptures later, no one's going to know what we're talking about. Let's use the modern name, so we're going to call it Ramses. It would be like if I said to you, have you ever been to New Amsterdam? Anybody? Who's been to New Amsterdam? Why? Because it's New York. But if I said, let's go to New Amsterdam, you'd be like, is pot legal there? Like, I don't know. But it's New York. It got renamed. It's the only thing that would make sense if I'm talking to you today. So it was Avaris then. And so this guy, Manfred Bitek, professor of archaeology at the University of Vienna, he's not a believer. He would probably hear what I'm teaching and go, wait, what? He starts coming across all of these things. This was in a Netflix special, by the way, that was really fascinating. And so it dates right to this time, late 19th century BC, right when we should expect to find Joseph. And all of a sudden, in this city of Avaris, you come across something that's totally different than Egyptian architecture. It's Syro-Palestinian. So somebody, all of a sudden, in 1870, builds this massive, by the way, in the ancient world, massive palace. Massive palace. And there's this obsession with the number 12 in all the architecture. 12 windows on each side, or in the courtyard, 12 columns that were there. Why would the number 12 be special to this house, do you think? 12 sons of Jacob, 12 tribes of Israel. That's the working theory. Maybe I'm wrong. Now, what's really fascinating is you go out into the yard and you find, so this is the big palace. You go out into the yard and you find 12 ancient tombs that date right to this period. So there's 1, there's 2, there's 3, there's 4, there's 5, there's 6, there's 7, there's 8, there's 9, there's 10, there's 11. Where's the 12th? It's this guy. One of the 12 is given a royal burial. Does this sound familiar? So Joseph is betrayed. He goes down to Egypt. He has these dreams. He interprets them for Pharaoh. And what does Pharaoh say? I am going to raise you up to my right hand. There is no one of higher authority in all of Egypt besides you, Joseph. And Joseph reigns over everything in Egypt except Pharaoh himself. And so all of a sudden we see a royal burial that's given to one of these 12 in the yard. Well, that's interesting. And what's also interesting is there's nothing in it. It's an empty tomb. There's no bones. Like, you can go to ancient tombs and ancient pyramids. You won't find oftentimes the treasure because there's people who rob the graves, but you always find the bones. We have the bones of so many pharaohs. You go to the Cairo Museum. I've looked at them in the face. They're really creepy. No bones. Why not? Well, Joseph made them swear that when you leave here, take my bones. And when Moses leaves, guess what they take? The bones of Joseph. No bones in there. Well, that's interesting. Well, we'll do this. Just to show you, this is the role that Joseph would have had. Amini was a governor in Egypt during the 12th dynasty, so same dynasty, about 60 years prior to Joseph. Look what he brags about. He says, no one was unhappy in my days, not even the years of famine, for I had tilled all the fields of Nome, the Nome of Ma. Nomes were little territories, up to its southern and northern frontiers. Thus I prolonged the life of its inhabitants and preserved the food which it produced. So the number 2 guy, the vizier as they were called, is always bragging about how he was successful even during times of famine. It was a big thing for that time period. You go inside the tomb and there's a statue, and this is a drawing of what it would have looked like. And what do you notice? It's weird for Egypt. Egyptian reliefs, Egyptians were always portrayed as having black hair that's slicked back. People that were coming from the Syro-Palestine area are often portrayed as having red hair. What color does Joseph or Jacob's brother have? Esau. Red hair, right? So it's in the bloodline. And so here you have a picture of Joseph. He's got this massive mushroom-shaped haircut. He's got pale skin, not Egyptian, and he's wearing a multicolored robe, right? Which is interesting. So this is the actual head from that statue that was inside that pyramid tomb. And you can still to this day see the red tint, which means he is not a native-born Egyptian. So this guy who's given a royal burial is not a native Egyptian. He's a foreigner. He comes from a different land, by the way, from Syro-Palestine. Ringing any bells, right? So you continue on and you can see here, I'm going to toggle back and forth. This is where they know that he was wearing the multicolored. If you adjust your eyes, you can see it. You see there where the remnants of paint. So he's wearing this multicolored robe, which officials would do. And I'm not saying this is the multicolored robe, obviously, that Jacob gave. But the multicolored robe was a symbol that you were set apart. That's why Jacob gives them the multicolored robe. It's like saying, you're my royal son. You're the one who's going to be powerful. And so this is by scale. If a human being was standing in it, that would be the height of this tomb. This is no small feat. This guy was very, very well respected. He's got a throwing stick on his shoulder, which is the Egyptian hieroglyph for foreigner. So again, it's emphasizing the fact that he's foreigner. And so this is where, you can see history actually changes at this moment. If you go to this dynasty at this particular pharaoh, his name's Amenemhat III, everything prior to this is very small government, limited government, right? Limited government. And power is spread. You have all these nomes that are spread out, and there's, they have a pharaoh, but really the nomes and the governors in these regions, they have authority. But something shifts really dramatically right at this particular time period. So if these are the governors, they're all equal height. We got equal power. We're not, Pharaoh obviously is the chief, but we have a lot of authority. And all of a sudden, you read in Genesis 47, this is the one thing that you can see Joseph did that was terrible. says Joseph has the grain, and the people come to him the first year, and he's like, oh, you want grain? Give me all your money. And then they come the next year, and they're like, we don't have any more money. And he's like, all right, well, give me all your cattle and livestock, all your industry, which is basically like the tractors and everything else. And then it's give me your land and give me your very lives. And it says that Joseph did what? He reduced the people of Egypt to servitude from one end of Egypt to the other. Do you get the irony here? Before the Egyptians enslaved the Israelites, it was an Israelite who enslaved the Egyptians. There's a message of big government somewhere in there. Right? What's good for one? Anyway, so Joseph takes all the wealth, and who is he giving it to? He takes all the industry, all the cattle, and who does he give it to? His boss. And guess what happens precisely at this time period? The power of the nomes and the governors basically goes to nothing, and the Pharaoh becomes all powerful, a god in the eyes of the people. What happened? Gee, it kind of fits the narrative, right? It's almost like hand in glove. So this is the Amenemhat III. He's called the troubled Pharaoh because a lot of bad stuff happened in Egypt during his reign, which you can obviously imagine. They date him to 1860 BC. You follow the biblical timeline, guess who should be alive right at that time period? Joseph. And so this is from Manfred Betak's report. So these are his direct words, which is echoing some of the stuff I've said. He said, we have evidence of a specialized Asiatic. Why does he call it Asiatic? Because it's not African, it's not Egyptian, it's from Asia, which includes Syro-Palestine, right? That's what he's talking about. It's not in Africa, it's foreign. Asiatic settlements around the Middle Kingdom, royal residents, especially from the reign of Amenemhat III. We found fragments of a colossal statue of limestone depicting an Asiatic dignitary with a mushroom-shaped coifer holding a throw stick at his right shoulder. It was a seated statue, nearly twice the life size, of excellent quality. The hair was painted red while the color of skin was yellow, which is right for the Canaanite region, the traditional color of Asiatics in Egyptian art. The form of this statue has no parallels in Egypt. This isn't common. Like with everybody else, this doesn't happen. You don't have Asiatic dignitaries given royal burials. But our statue was smashed intentionally, suggesting that there was political turmoil in the region. Can you imagine a reason why the Egyptians might hate this guy? I could. Maybe reducing them to slavery. The direct proximity of the tombs to the palace is certainly an Asiatic tradition. You never put tombs next to a palace. It was gross. It was defiled. You never put that close to royalty. The burial of donkeys in front of the tombs is known from Middle Bronze Age culture of Palestine. The tombs yielded weaponry that was Syro-Palestinian in type. Everything is screaming, this guy comes from the land of Israel or Syria. Everything. Even the design of the house. And so they keep digging around and they find this ring. This is just cool to me. Manfred Betak doesn't make a big deal out of it. It's just like a note in his thing. But listen to what he says. He says, we found an amethyst scarab mounted on a gold ring and inscribed with the title and the name of its owner, which this drives me crazy. The side of this thing is damaged. That's where the name would have been. Damaged by tomb robbers, most probably the owner, based on the hieroglyphs that are left, was an overseer of foreign countries who had responsibility for the organization of trading expeditions. What was Joseph's primary job under Pharaoh? You've stored up all this grain, you have massive silos, and now all the nations of the world that are in famine are coming to you, Joseph. So what would Joseph's title be? He would be maybe like an overseer of foreign trade. Oh, there it is, right? And a gold ring. What did Pharaoh say when he said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt? And Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger, put it on Joseph's finger, and all the countries came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph. Think about all these clues coming together. Who is this guy? What is this tomb? Who is this Asiatic dignitary? And as you'll find out later, there's massive silos in Avaris, but you have to come back next week for that stuff because it's cool. And by the way, all of Egyptology agrees that at this particular time period, the whole world starts coming to Egypt. So this is a real page turner. The political situation in Egypt during the Second Intermediate Period. I highly recommend it, right? But in this book, they write that there's a massive migration from Syro-Palestine tribes. Well, guess where Jacob and his brothers are? That's where they're coming from. And they come down into the Egyptian delta, and that took place in the 19th century, precisely at the time of Joseph's famine. So all the details right there, bam, 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 bam. This is an actual contemporary of that time period named Nefertiti, not Nefertiti. I always want to say that, but it's not. Around 1900 BC, laments that there's all these Semitic people coming into the Nile for food. What does he write? All happiness has gone away. The land is cast down in trouble because of those what? Feeders. These people are coming to eat. Asiatics, foreigners from that region who are throughout the land. Massive crowds of people coming to find grain. Enemies have arisen in the east. Asiatics have come down to Egypt. And so the animosity begins to build against these Asiatics. This is a fascinating thing. And if you look at a Google map, you'll see up there is the Nile Delta. The Nile River comes along. And then all of a sudden, there's something called the Fayum Oasis. This used to be desert land. But about 1870 BC, notice the timestamp, somebody had a great idea that this is depressed land. And so if you dug a canal, all the water from the Nile would flow into that, and you could irrigate and increase the amount of farmland, increasing crops of grain and barley and all that kind of stuff. You know what that canal, for as long as we can trace it, has been known as? The Bar Yosef, or the Canal of Joseph. What did Joseph do? He surveyed the land to maximize crops. And in Egypt, where life was in the east, and they put only tombs and burials on the west side of the Nile, I love that Joseph, the man of God, brings life to the west, that the Egyptians only associated with death. God is preaching here. It's amazing. But you can see, as we're driving around, those are taken with my camera on 11/19/2010, you can see. And you can see the area that you're driving around before you get to the Fayum, and then you get to the Fayum, and it's like life. It's like, oh, we're here. I mean, it just looks beautiful. This is me standing next to the Canal of Joseph. What a handsome guy. Look at that hair. Ministry. Just took it out of me. So this was a guy who was also an official of Amenemhat III, and he describes his regime. Get this. So this guy, and this is called the Lahun Papyrus, his name's Keti, which is a name that means farming in Sanskrit or cultivation. It's more likely a title. But he says that during his office, he harvested in the Fayum Oasis. So it's Amenemhat III. It's Joseph's time period, stamped right here. This is when the Fayum Oasis was born. And listen to what he says. Keti, it's very short papyrus. You can see it in the background, the blurred out thing behind it. That's the papyrus. And the only line that we can get from his resume is, get this, he impoverished his associates for the benefit of others. What did Joseph do? He enslaved the Egyptians, his own associates. And who got the best parts of the land? Jacob's sons, Joseph's brothers. And so whoever this is, if it's Joseph, I don't think it's Joseph, but it's an official of that same administration who's like, yeah, we impoverished our own people for the benefit of others. When does that make sense? I mean, it all just comes together. Amenemhat III, 1860 BC. Originally, he built his pyramid called the Black Pyramid way up north. And then all of a sudden, this is kind of unheard of. He stops building his pyramid and says, scrap that one. I'm going to build one down south. And he goes, and it's one of the 5 southernmost pyramids ever built. And he decides to build it, 100 yards away from the Bar Yosef, the canal that Joseph dug. So he's like, this canal was so precious to my regime. It so saved my regime. We're abandoning the building of that pyramid. I want to be buried next to this thing. And so when you're at the Bar Yosef, you can walk up a hill and go into the pyramid of Amenemhat III. And so you look at all of this. Does that sound like Joseph to you? If you're cynical, if you're skeptical, about what? Like you follow the Bible, all the cities, all the names, all the cultural, all the cultural clues, the norms, they're digging at the Sodom, the story of Joseph being born out as they dig under this thing. And it's like, my goodness, like when you read, this is real. And you know what it's all pointing to? It's all absolutely sovereignly ordained in all of history. But you know what I love about the Joseph story? Even though it's absolutely being sovereignly ordained into history, you know what God is doing? Even in the life of Joseph, he is preaching a story of a far greater Joseph. If you wanted to sum up the life of Joseph, and we'll close with this, but this is another apologetic, another defense of the scripture by itself. 1,800 years before Jesus, listen to the story of his life. Joseph is a shepherd. He's one of 12 sons of Jacob, but Joseph is the beloved son of his father. He's clothed in special robes. He's regal. And he testifies of his brother's sins. He dreams that every knee will bow to him. His brothers plot to kill him. Judah, which is the Hebrew of the Greek Judas, betrays him for silver coins. And so Joseph is stripped of his robe. His tunic is dipped in blood, which, by the way, Revelation says Jesus, when he comes back, will have his robe dipped in blood. It's a nod to Joseph. He's bound and led away where? To the land of death. He's falsely accused. He's imprisoned between two criminals. You remember that? One of those criminals, Joseph prophesies, is going to be restored and given his royal title back, and the other one is going to be condemned. What happens to Jesus as he's dying? He's put between two criminals, one of which Jesus will look at and say, I tell you the truth, this day you will be with me in paradise. You're going back to the throne. And the other one will be condemned. Joseph forgave his persecutors, the ones that had wronged him. And then, after ascending out of this pit, this prison, he is raised up to the right hand of Pharaoh, who is considered God Most High in Egypt. And what does he do? He clothes his family with regal robes and gives them life-saving bread, the bread of life, for free to them. And he clothes his brothers in the finest of linens, bright, shining, white, the most valuable you could find. And he has prepared a place for his brothers. That's true. We see it in the archaeology. And you know what God is doing as he ordains this story in history? Wait till you see what I got for you. Because I got a better Joseph who came and was betrayed. And he offers the bread of life freely, but he doesn't do it by enslaving others. He sets all the captives free. He gives his life. He's reduced. He's bloodied. Why? To prepare a place for you, to clothe you in the finest robes of righteousness, to give you the very best of heaven at great expense to himself. We can lean on the Word of God. We can lean on these promises. We can grab hold of this hope. Our Savior is sure. He ordains these stories that happened 4,000 years ago. And he brings them in exactly as he intends. And he's the one who holds our future. And we have much reason to hope. Do we not? Amen? Let me pray for us. Father, Lord, I thank you so much. I thank you for the men who go out and dig all this stuff up and find all these things. I thank you for the encouragement of faith. Lord, I pray that tonight was clear, that our faith is encouraged. Lord, I thank you for these stories. But more than all of these stories, Lord, I pray if it's just academic knowledge, if it's just things to tickle our brains, this would be a wasted night in the long run. But Lord, help us to remember that these men who've gone before us, who've clinged to your promises and were rewarded, that you showed your faithfulness to, that we can see as the excavations take place, Lord, you were faithful to them. And you will be faithful to us, Lord. Help us to walk away from here, not just with academic knowledge, but with zeal in our heart to see that you are real and your promises are real. And I pray that on behalf of everybody here. And everybody said, amen. All right. God bless you. Have a great night. I still got 2 minutes. What do you want to talk about? Yeah. You're free to go. I'll take questions.